Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that three narrow waterways, each less than 200 kilometers long, control more global economic power than all the world's central banks, stock exchanges, and government treasuries combined? And what if I told you that a coordinated attack on these three choke points could shut down 60% of global trade, collapse American supply chains, and trigger the greatest economic crisis in human history within a matter of days? Most people believe that global trade flows through vast oceans under the protection of international law and modern naval power. They assume that the movement of goods between continents depends on market forces, commercial relationships, and technological capabilities that cannot be easily disrupted by hostile actors or natural disasters. They do not recognize what I recognize: the complete subordination of global commerce to three geographic choke points so narrow that blocking them would paralyze world civilization and destroy the economic foundations of every developed nation on Earth. This is not trade policy. This is economic physics. The mathematical reality that modern prosperity depends entirely on the uninterrupted flow of cargo through waterways so strategically critical that controlling them provides more power over global civilization than nuclear weapons, cyber warfare, or financial manipulation. The Suez Canal, Panama Canal, and Strait of Malacca represent the three most critical maritime choke points in the global economy, collectively carrying approximately $9.6 trillion worth of trade annually, and serving as the arteries through which the lifeblood of international commerce flows between continents. These waterways are not merely convenient shipping routes that reduce transportation costs and delivery times. They are essential infrastructure, without which modern global trade patterns, supply chain networks, and economic relationships could not exist. The Suez Canal connects Europe and Asia through the shortest maritime route available, allowing cargo ships to avoid the 14,000-kilometer detour around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. This 193-kilometer waterway handles approximately 12% of global trade and 30% of all container ship traffic, making it the most economically critical artificial waterway ever constructed. Every day, over 50 ships carrying everything from oil and natural gas to consumer electronics and agricultural products pass through the Suez Canal on their way to markets in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. The Panama Canal provides the only practical connection between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the American continents, allowing ships to avoid the treacherous 12,000-kilometer journey around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. This 82-kilometer waterway handles 6% of global trade and is particularly critical for American imports from Asia, as it provides the shortest route for Asian goods to reach American East Coast ports and distribution centers. The Strait of Malacca, located between Malaysia and Indonesia, serves as the primary shipping route between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, and is the only practical passage for large cargo vessels traveling between Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. This narrow waterway, just 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, handles 25% of all traded goods, and 60% of Asian trade, making it the busiest shipping lane in the world and the most strategically important natural choke point in global commerce. The mathematical reality of global trade dependency on these three choke points cannot be overstated. Combined, the Suez Canal, Panama Canal, and Strait of Malacca handle approximately 60% of all international shipping by value, representing trade flows worth over $9.6 trillion annually. This means that the majority of goods traded between nations must pass through at least one of these three narrow waterways to reach their destinations. The concentration of global trade through such narrow geographic corridors creates vulnerabilities that have no historical precedent in terms of their potential impact on world civilization. Previous strategic choke points controlled regional trade or affected specific commodities, but never before has the majority of global commerce depended on the simultaneous operation of just three waterways that could be blocked, damaged, or controlled by hostile actors. The vulnerability of this system became apparent in March 2021 when the Ever Given a 400-meter container ship weighing over 220,000 tons ran aground in the Suez Canal and blocked the waterway for 6 days, creating a traffic jam that ultimately involved over 400 vessels carrying goods worth approximately $9.6 billion. The single incident, caused by high winds and human error during a routine transit, demonstrated how quickly modern commerce could collapse when critical shipping routes are interrupted by even relatively minor incidents. The immediate impact on American imports was severe and revealed the frightening extent to which American consumer goods, industrial components, and energy supplies depend on uninterrupted flow through a single narrow waterway controlled by a foreign government. Within 48 hours of the blockage, American companies across multiple industries began experiencing shortages of electronic components manufactured in Asian facilities, petroleum products refined in Middle Eastern facilities, and consumer goods produced in European manufacturing centers. American retail giants including Walmart, Target, Amazon, and Best Buy reported immediate inventory disruptions affecting thousands of product categories. as cargo ships carrying spring merchandise, electronic devices, automotive parts, and seasonal goods remained trapped behind the grounded vessel. The sophisticated, just-in-time inventory management systems that these companies had spent decades optimizing suddenly became liabilities, as they lacked the flexibility needed to accommodate unexpected shipping delays. The Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach, which together handle approximately 40% of American container imports, experienced severe cargo backups as delayed ships arrived simultaneously after the canal reopened, overwhelming port capacity and creating additional delays that persisted for weeks after the initial blockage was cleared. Cargo handling equipment, warehouse space, and inland transportation systems that had been optimized for predictable shipping schedules proved inadequate for managing the concentrated arrival of delayed vessels. The economic cost of the 6-day blockage exceeded $54 billion in delayed trade, and demonstrated how rapidly a single choke point failure could cascade through global supply chains to affect American consumers, businesses, and industrial operations. More importantly, the incident revealed that modern, just-in-time manufacturing and retail systems have no resilience against shipping disruptions affecting critical maritime routes. American companies that had optimized their supply chains around predictable shipping schedules found themselves unable to maintain production when critical components failed to arrive on schedule. Automotive manufacturers including Ford, General Motors, and Tesla were forced to slow production lines as semiconductor shipments from Asian suppliers were delayed by the canal blockage. The pharmaceutical industry experienced similar disruptions as active pharmaceutical ingredients manufactured in India and China failed to reach American drug manufacturing facilities according to planned delivery schedules. The Food and Drug Administration issued warnings about potential medication shortages as pharmaceutical companies struggled to maintain production without reliable access to essential chemical components. The agricultural sector faced immediate challenges as fertilizer shipments from the Middle East and Europe were delayed, affecting planting schedules for American farmers preparing for spring growing seasons. The timing of the blockage during critical agricultural planning periods amplified its impact on American food production systems. The psychological impact on American supply chain managers and logistics professionals was profound. The Ever Given incident demonstrated that supply chain optimization strategies that had been developed over decades could be rendered worthless by a single shipping accident in a waterway located thousands of kilometers from American shores. Companies that had invested billions in lean inventory management and just-in-time delivery systems discovered that their efficiency gains came at the cost of resilience against disruptions beyond their control. But the Suez Canal blockage represented only a preview of the vulnerabilities inherent in the global choke point system. The incident lasted 6 days and affected a single waterway. A coordinated attack on all 3 critical choke points simultaneously would create disruptions of a completely different magnitude and duration. The mathematical modeling of a simultaneous blockage of the Suez Canal, Panama Canal, and Strait of Malacca reveals economic consequences that would dwarf any previous commercial disruption in human history and fundamentally alter the structure of global civilization. Such an event would immediately halt 60% of global trade, affecting approximately $26 billion in daily commercial transactions, and disrupting supply chains for virtually every category of internationally traded goods, from basic commodities to advanced technology products. The cascading effects would begin within hours, as automated inventory systems at major retailers detected shipment delays and began adjusting delivery schedules and stock allocation procedures. Within 24 hours, logistics coordinators at companies throughout the United States would recognize that their carefully optimized supply chain networks were facing disruption on a scale that exceeded all contingency planning and emergency response procedures. American imports would experience immediate and catastrophic disruption, as alternative shipping routes proved completely inadequate to handle the volume of cargo normally flowing through the blocked waterways. Ships forced to navigate around Africa via the Cape of Good Hope would face journey times 21 days longer than normal Suez Canal routes, while vessels avoiding the Panama Canal would require 18 additional days to reach American ports via the treacherous Cape Horn routes around the southern tip of South America. The container ship capacity required to maintain normal trade flows using these extended alternative routes simply does not exist in the global shipping fleet, creating an immediate crisis in cargo transportation availability. The additional sailing time, increased fuel consumption, and higher insurance costs associated with longer routes would reduce effective shipping capacity by approximately 35–40%, creating immediate shortages of vessels available for commercial cargo movement between continents. Shipping costs would increase by 200–400% as demand for available vessels far exceeded supply. American consumer prices would experience immediate and severe increases as the costs of extended shipping routes, vessel shortages, and cargo delays were passed directly to importers and retailers. Economic modeling suggests that consumer goods prices would increase by 25–45% within 30 days of a simultaneous choke point blockage, with some categories of imported products becoming completely unavailable. The impact on American energy markets would be equally severe, as approximately 35% of American petroleum imports transit through the blocked waterways under normal shipping conditions. Alternative routing of energy shipments would increase transportation costs and delivery times sufficiently to trigger significant price increases for gasoline, heating oil, and other petroleum products consumed by American households and businesses. Industrial production throughout the United States would face immediate challenges as critical components and raw materials from international suppliers failed to arrive according to established delivery schedules. Manufacturing facilities operating on just-in-time principles would exhaust their limited inventory within days and be forced to reduce or halt production until alternative supply sources could be established. The automotive industry would be particularly vulnerable because modern vehicle production depends on complex international supply chains that source components from multiple continents. Semiconductor chips from Asia, steel from Europe, and other essential components transit the critical choke points as part of integrated production systems that cannot quickly adapt to alternative shipping routes. The pharmaceutical sector would face potential catastrophe, as the vast majority of active pharmaceutical ingredients used in American medications are manufactured in Asia and must transit either the Suez Canal or Strait of Malacca to reach American facilities. Extended shipping times and cargo shortages could create medication shortages affecting millions of Americans who depend on prescription drugs for chronic conditions. Food security would emerge as a critical concern as agricultural products, fertilizers, and food processing ingredients from international suppliers experienced severe shipping delays. While the United States maintains substantial domestic food production, American consumers have become accustomed to year-round availability of fresh produce, spices, and specialty foods that depend on international shipping networks. The strategic implications of simultaneous choke point blockage extend beyond immediate economic disruption to encompass fundamental questions about American national security and the resilience of globalized economic systems. American military operations, civilian infrastructure, and government services all depend on international supply chains that transit the critical maritime choke points. The Department of Defense has conducted classified assessments of American vulnerability to shipping choke point disruptions, recognizing that American military readiness depends on access to foreign suppliers for critical materials, components, and fuel supplies. Extended disruption of global shipping routes could affect American military capabilities and limit the government's ability to respond to international crises or domestic emergencies. American allies and strategic partners would face similar challenges, potentially limiting their ability to provide military, economic, or diplomatic support during crisis periods when American leadership would be most needed. The interconnected nature of modern alliance relationships means that economic disruption affecting multiple countries simultaneously could undermine collective security arrangements and international cooperation mechanisms. The financial implications of choke point blockage would cascade through American and global financial systems as companies faced supply shortages, increased costs, and revenue losses that affected their ability to meet debt obligations and maintain operations. Banks, insurance companies, and investment funds with exposure to international trade and transportation sectors would face potential losses that could trigger broader financial instability. Currency markets would experience severe volatility as traders attempted to price the impact of trade disruptions on different national economies. The US dollar's role as the global reserve currency could be challenged if American economic disruption proved more severe than that experienced by other major economies with more diverse trade relationships and supply chain networks. The technological sophistication of modern cargo tracking, port management, and logistics coordination systems creates additional vulnerabilities because these systems are optimized for efficiency under normal operating conditions rather than resilience during crisis periods. Alternative routing of massive cargo volumes would overwhelm port facilities, customs processing systems, and inland transportation networks that lack the capacity to handle diverted traffic. Emergency response procedures for large-scale shipping disruptions remain underdeveloped because the scale and complexity of simultaneous choke point blockage exceeds the scope of traditional disaster planning. Government agencies, private companies, and international organizations lack the institutional capabilities needed to coordinate alternative shipping arrangements on the scale required to maintain essential trade flows. The legal and regulatory frameworks governing international shipping provide limited mechanisms for managing emergency situations affecting multiple critical waterways simultaneously. International maritime law, commercial shipping contracts, and insurance policies are designed for normal operating conditions rather than catastrophic disruption scenarios that could affect the global economy for months or years. The concentration of global trade through 3 critical choke points represents a fundamental design flaw in the architecture of modern international commerce. The efficiency gains achieved through optimized shipping routes and centralized transportation networks have created systemic vulnerabilities that could be exploited by hostile actors seeking to inflict maximum damage on global economic systems. State actors with advanced military capabilities could potentially coordinate attacks on multiple choke points simultaneously, creating disruption that would affect their adversaries more severely than their own domestic economies. Non-state actors, including terrorist organizations, have demonstrated interest in attacking critical infrastructure and could view shipping choke points as high-value targets capable of generating massive economic damage with relatively modest operational requirements. Natural disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation pose additional threats to critical waterways that could trigger disruptions comparable to deliberate attacks. Extreme weather events, earthquake damage, or ecological disasters affecting any of the three choke points could create extended blockages that would severely test the resilience of global supply chain systems. The aging infrastructure of the Suez and Panama Canals creates maintenance requirements and upgrade needs that could necessitate planned closures or emergency shutdowns during critical periods. The narrow width and depth constraints of these artificial waterways limit the size of vessels that can transit safely and create bottlenecks during periods of heavy shipping traffic. The geopolitical control of critical choke points provides enormous leverage to the countries that operate these waterways. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, Panama controls the Panama Canal, and Malaysia and Indonesia jointly control access to the Strait of Malacca. These countries possess the ability to restrict shipping, impose additional fees, or completely close their waterways in response to international disputes or domestic political considerations. Recent examples of choke point weaponization include Egypt and its threats to restrict Suez Canal access during diplomatic disputes, and Panama's consideration of limiting canal usage in response to climate change and water scarcity concerns. These incidents demonstrate how quickly commercial waterways can become tools of international coercion that affect countries far from the actual choke points. The Chinese government has invested heavily in alternative shipping routes and port facilities that could potentially bypass traditional choke points, recognizing the strategic vulnerability created by dependence on waterways controlled by other countries. The Belt and Road Initiative includes substantial investments in overland transportation corridors and alternative port facilities designed to reduce Chinese dependence on maritime choke points. American strategic planners have begun developing contingency plans for extended choke point disruptions, but these plans focus primarily on government and military requirements rather than comprehensive protection of civilian commerce and consumer goods. The scale and complexity of modern international trade make it virtually impossible to maintain normal economic activity using alternative transportation methods during extended maritime blockages. The transformation of global commerce from a resilient system with multiple transportation options into a hyper-efficient network dependent on three critical choke points represents one of the most dangerous strategic developments of the modern era. The efficiency gains that have driven economic globalization have come at the cost of systemic stability and national security for every country that depends on international trade. The mathematical certainty of choke point vulnerability cannot be disputed through policy rhetoric or military posturing. 60% of global trade flows through three narrow waterways that can be blocked by determined actors with relatively modest capabilities. Alternative routes exist, but lack the capacity, infrastructure, and efficiency needed to maintain modern commercial relationships. This dependency represents the Achilles heel of globalized civilization. The waterways that enable unprecedented prosperity also create unprecedented vulnerability. The same geographic features that allow efficient movement of goods between continents can be turned into weapons against the economic systems that depend on them. Most people do not understand how completely their daily lives depend on the uninterrupted operation of three narrow waterways located thousands of kilometers from their homes and controlled by foreign governments with foreign priorities. The food they eat, the clothes they wear, the electronics they use, and the fuel they consume all depend on cargo ships successfully navigating through choke points that could be blocked tomorrow by actors beyond their control or by natural disasters beyond human prediction. The three-canal trap is not a theoretical vulnerability. It is a mathematical reality that governs the movement of goods and the stability of prices throughout the global economy. The choke points that make modern commerce possible also make modern civilization vulnerable to disruption on a scale that would affect every person on Earth. The narrow waterways that connect oceans have become the narrow foundations on which human prosperity rests. When those foundations are threatened, everything built upon them becomes unstable. The global economy that has lifted billions from poverty depends entirely on keeping three small waterways open and operational. This is how geographic reality shapes economic possibility. Three narrow passages control more wealth than all the world its treasuries because they control the movement of goods that creates wealth. The countries that control these passages hold more power over global prosperity than countries that control oil reserves, gold deposits, or technological innovations. The age of maritime choke points as mere shipping conveniences has ended. These waterways have become weapons that can be wielded against global civilization itself. Most people still do not understand what this means, but their economic survival depends entirely on decisions made by operators of 3 narrow canals located in foreign countries with foreign priorities, and foreign vulnerabilities to pressure that could affect their willingness to keep global trade flowing. If learning that 3 narrow waterways control 60% of global trade left you stunned, you're not ready for what I'm about to reveal next. The choke points I've shown you are just the beginning. There's an even more vulnerable system that could bring civilization to its knees, and it's hiding in plain sight. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the next video exposes a dependency so critical that when you understand it, you'll realize everything you thought you knew about modern security was an illusion. The patterns are accelerating, and only those who see them first will be prepared for what's coming.